The November fog of 1895 had descended upon London with the persistence of an unwelcome guest, transforming the familiar streets into a labyrinth of muted gaslight and shadow. From our comfortable quarters at 221B Baker Street, the world beyond our windows appeared as a study in grey watercolours, where the clip-clop of horses' hooves echoed with an almost spectral quality through the dampened air. It was on such an evening, as I sat reading the latest medical journals by the flickering warmth of our fireplace, that Mrs. Hudson announced a visitor whose arrival would thrust us into one of the most perplexing cases of our long partnership. Holmes had been in one of his contemplative moods for the better part of the afternoon, seated in his favourite armchair with his long fingers steepled before his lips, his grey eyes fixed upon some invisible point in the middle distance. The cocaine bottle remained untouched upon the mantelpiece, always a promising sign. But the restless energy that typically preceded his periods of intense intellectual activity was unmistakably present in the slight tension of his shoulders and the occasional drumming of his fingers against the chair's worn leather arm. Our visitor proved to be a gentleman of perhaps 50 years, impeccably dressed despite the inclement weather, though his usually steady hands betrayed a nervous tremor as he removed his gloves. His face, framed by a carefully maintained grey beard, bore the pallor of a man who had recently encountered something that challenged his fundamental understanding of the natural world. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he inquired, his voice carrying the educated tones of a professional man, though underscored by an unmistakable current of anxiety. Holmes rose with fluid grace, his keen eyes already cataloguing details that would escape the notice of ordinary observers. "Indeed. And you, sir, are a man of engineering background. Civil engineering, I should say, given the particular type of clay beneath your fingernails and the slight callus on your right index finger consistent with frequent use of surveying instruments. You have recently been underground, in tunnels specifically, and what you encountered there has disturbed your sleep for at least a week, judging by the shadows beneath your eyes." Our visitor's mouth fell slightly agape. "Extraordinary. Yes, you are quite correct on all counts. My name is Reginald Hartwell, Chief Engineer for the Metropolitan Railway Company. I have come to you, Mr. Holmes, because what I have witnessed defies all rational explanation, yet threatens to undermine public confidence in London's underground transportation system." Holmes gestured toward the chair opposite his own. "Pray be seated, Mr. Hartwell, and tell us of this phenomenon that has so thoroughly unsettled a man of your evident scientific temperament." Hartwell settled himself carefully, withdrawing a leather portfolio from his coat. "It began approximately 6 weeks ago, with isolated reports from our maintenance crews. Workers on the night shifts claimed to hear voices emanating from the tunnel walls themselves, not echoes, mind you, but distinct human speech, as if conversations were taking place within the very earth. And these reports were initially dismissed as imagination or acoustic tricks," I interjected. "Precisely, Dr. Watson, until the incidents began to multiply and focus themselves with disturbing regularity." Hartwell opened his portfolio and withdrew a detailed map of London's underground network. "The phenomenon has concentrated itself along a specific route, Mr. Holmes. For the past fortnight, between the hours of midnight and 3 in the morning, multiple witnesses have reported hearing a voice, always the same voice, calling out from beneath the streets." Holmes leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. "Describe this voice, if you please." "It is a man's voice, cultured, speaking in clear English, though with an accent I cannot place. The words are often indistinct, but certain phrases have been repeated with such consistency that our men have memorized them." Hartwell consulted his notes. "The 7th seal must be broken, and the foundation stones remember. Most disturbing of all, Mr. Holmes, the voice has begun calling out specific names of people connected to the railway's construction." A chill ran down my spine as Holmes's eyes narrowed with predatory focus. "And where, precisely, has this voice been heard most recently?" Hartwell's finger traced a line on his map, stopping at a point that made my blood run cold. "Here, Mr. Holmes, directly beneath Baker Street itself. 3 separate teams of engineers, working on routine maintenance of the subsurface lines, have reported hearing the voice calling from the earth beneath this very street. Last night, it spoke a name that sent my most experienced foreman fleeing from the tunnels." "What name?" Holmes asked, though I suspected he already knew the answer. "Holmes," Hartwell whispered. It called out Holmes 3 times, as clear as I am speaking to you now. The silence that followed was broken only by the gentle hiss of the gas lamps and the distant rumble of traffic above. Holmes rose and began his characteristic pacing before the fireplace, his mind clearly racing through the implications of what he had heard. "You have, I assume, investigated the physical possibility of someone concealing themselves within the tunnel system?" he asked. "Exhaustively. We have examined every inch of accessible tunnel, every maintenance shaft, every ventilation grating. The voice appears to emanate from solid earth and bedrock, from spaces where no human being could possibly exist." Hartwell's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Mr. Holmes, I am a man of science, but what we are dealing with here appears to transcend the natural world. The voice knows things, details about the railway's construction that were never made public, names of workers who died during the excavation process decades ago. It speaks of foundation stones and seals, as if London itself were built upon some ancient secret." Holmes ceased his pacing and fixed Hartwell with an intense stare. "You mentioned that names of construction workers have been called. Do you have a list of these individuals?" "Indeed." Hartwell produced another document. 7 names in total, all men who perished during various phases of the underground construction. But here is the most disturbing aspect, Mr. Holmes. Each man died under mysterious circumstances. Cave-ins that defied engineering explanation, sudden illnesses that baffled physicians, accidents that seemed almost deliberate. My medical training compelled me to ask, what sort of illnesses? Rapid onset of symptoms resembling poisoning, though no toxic substances were ever identified. The men would report hearing voices calling their names in the days before their deaths, voices that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the tunnels they were constructing. Holmes had returned to his chair, but his posture remained alert, coiled like a spring ready for release. Most fascinating, a voice from the earth that knows the past and calls to the present. Tell me, Mr. Hartwell, have you brought any physical evidence of these manifestations? I have something that may be relevant. Hartwell reached into his portfolio once more and withdrew a small object wrapped in cloth. This was found yesterday morning at the exact spot where the voice was heard calling your name. One of my men discovered it embedded in the tunnel wall, as if it had been pressed into the earth itself. He unwrapped the object to reveal a small brass medallion, tarnished with age but bearing a clearly visible inscription. MRC 7, 1863. Below the letters was an intricate symbol that appeared to be a combination of surveying instruments and what looked suspiciously like occult markings. Holmes examined the medallion with his magnifying glass, his expression growing increasingly grave. Metropolitan Railway Company, 7th Division, 1863. The year construction began on the Baker Street line. But this symbol... He looked up at Hartwell with eyes that gleamed with the unmistakable light of intellectual hunger mixed with something approaching concern. "Mr. Hartwell, I believe you have brought us a case that may prove to be one of the most extraordinary we have ever encountered." He rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the fog-shrouded street below. "Watson, it appears that the very ground beneath our feet holds secrets that someone, or something, is determined to reveal. The game, as they say, is most decidedly afoot." As if summoned by his words, a distant rumble echoed from somewhere far below, a sound that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of London itself. In that moment, I realized we were about to embark upon an investigation that would challenge not only our deductive abilities, but our understanding of the possible itself. The voice under Baker Street had called, and Sherlock Holmes was prepared to answer. The rumble from beneath our feet had scarcely faded when Holmes turned from the window, his keen eyes already dissecting the problem with that methodical precision that marked the commencement of his most challenging investigations. The brass medallion lay upon our table like an ancient talisman, its surface catching the gaslight in a manner that seemed almost deliberate. "Before we venture into speculation about supernatural manifestations, Watson," Holmes began, settling into his chair with the medallion in hand, "let us first establish what can be deduced from tangible evidence." He gestured toward a small parcel that Mrs. Hudson had placed upon the side table. "Tell me, what do you observe about that package?" I examined the modest parcel, wrapped in brown paper and tied with hemp twine. "It appears to be from my Aunt Clara, judging by her distinctive double-slip knot and the faint scent of lavender that always accompanies her correspondence." "Ah, but observe more carefully," Holmes said, rising to examine the package without touching it. "While the knot is indeed a skillful imitation of your aunt's method, note the weight distribution, far too substantial for her customarily frugal mailings. The paper bears the grocer's watermark from Baker Street, and the lavender scent overlays a stronger aroma of Earl Grey tea. Mrs. Hudson has attempted a small deception, perhaps to test whether I would notice her playful mimicry." I stared in astonishment as Holmes's deduction proved correct. The package contained a tin of premium tea, accompanied by a note from our landlady expressing her amusement at her successful ruse. "You see, Watson, how easily surface similarities can mislead even the observant mind. This principle shall prove crucial in our investigation of Mr. Hartwell's underground voice." Holmes returned his attention to the medallion, examining it through his magnifying glass. "Metropolitan Railway Company, 7th Division, 1863, the most challenging section of the original line construction. But this symbol—" He traced the intricate design with his finger. "A surveyor's compass, theodolite, and what appears to be a 7-pointed star, not standard railway iconography." At that moment, Mrs. Hudson announced another visitor, an elderly gentleman with ink-stained fingers and the stooped posture of a lifelong scholar. Holmes had clearly been expecting him. "Dr. Watson, may I present Professor Aldrich Thornfield, antiquarian and expert in Victorian archaeological discoveries. Professor, I believe you have information regarding the Baker Street excavations of 1863. Thornfield nodded gravely, producing a leather-bound journal from his coat. "Indeed, Mr. Holmes. Your inquiry prompted me to consult the private papers of Cornelius Blackwood, the original chief engineer of the 7th Division. Most illuminating and rather disturbing." He opened the journal to a marked page. "Blackwood documented the discovery of pre-existing chambers during the excavation, natural cavities that showed evidence of human habitation from centuries past, stone arrangements, primitive tools, and what he described as ritualistic configurations of bone and carved symbols." "And the response of his superiors?" Holmes inquired. "Swift and decisive suppression. Within days, Blackwood received explicit orders to seal the chambers and make no mention of their contents in official reports. The 7 men who had witnessed these discoveries began exhibiting disturbed behavior, claims of hearing ancient voices, dreams of being instructed to break the 7th seal and release what was bound." Holmes leaned forward intently. "The same 7 men whose names are now being called by this underground voice?" "Precisely. All died within a fortnight of reporting these experiences, though Blackwood suspected murder rather than accident. He himself disappeared 3 days after his final journal entry, leaving behind only this medallion and his private notes." Holmes rose and moved to his collection of London maps, selecting one that showed the underground watercourses. "Professor, your research confirms a crucial element of this puzzle. Watson, observe the route Mr. Hartwell described. It follows precisely the path of the old Tyburn River." He traced the line with his finger. "The Tyburn was culverted and incorporated into London's sewer system, but a buried watercourse remains an excellent conductor of sound. If someone wished to project their voice across considerable distances underground, they could hardly choose a better acoustic instrument." Then you believe this is an elaborate hoax? I asked. An elaborate and deadly serious deception designed to appear supernatural while serving very human purposes, Holmes replied. The question remains, who benefits from resurrecting these 30-year-old secrets, and why has my name been specifically invoked? As if summoned by his words, a distant sound echoed from the street below, not the familiar rumble of trains, but something that resembled human speech, muffled by earth and stone, yet unmistakably deliberate. Holmes moved swiftly to the window and threw it open. For a moment, we stood in absolute silence, straining to hear what lay beneath the ordinary sounds of London evening. Then it came again, clearer this time, rising from the very pavement beneath our feet. Holmes! The foundation stones. Remember! Professor Thornfield's face had gone pale. Gentlemen, he whispered, I fear we are dealing with something far more dangerous than mere archaeological curiosity. If someone has indeed discovered Blackwood's sealed chambers and learned what was hidden there, then London itself may be in greater peril than we can imagine. Holmes closed the window with deliberate care, his expression grim but determined. Then we shall descend tonight to meet this voice face to face. Whatever secrets lie buried beneath Baker Street, they have remained hidden long enough. The November fog had thickened by the time we descended through the Metropolitan Railway's maintenance entrance on Marylebone Road, transforming our lanterns into mere pools of amber light in the subterranean darkness. It was shortly before midnight when Holmes, myself, Professor Thornfield, and Mr. Hartwell gathered at the iron gates that guarded London's underground arteries, our breath visible in the chill air as we prepared for our descent into the labyrinth beneath Baker Street. Holmes had insisted upon bringing an array of scientific instruments, his acoustic equipment, chemical testing apparatus, and what appeared to be a primitive sound recording device of his own design. His dark eyes gleamed with anticipation as he adjusted the various gauges and dials, transforming our investigation into something resembling a scientific expedition into the unknown. The descent into darkness. We descended through a series of iron ladders and narrow corridors, the familiar sounds of London gradually fading above us, until only the echo of our footsteps and the distant whisper of the culverted Tyburn remained. The air grew thick with mingled scents of damp earth, coal smoke, and something else, something ancient and organic that spoke of centuries undisturbed. Mind your step, gentlemen, Hartwell cautioned as he led us deeper into the tunnel system. The voice has been most consistent in its timing, between midnight and 3 o'clock, always beginning with the same phrase about the seventh seal. Our night crews have abandoned this section entirely, not from cowardice, but from genuine concern for their sanity. Holmes paused at each junction to consult his compass and make notations in his pocketbook, his methodical approach lending scientific precision to what might otherwise have seemed a supernatural investigation. Watson, observe the construction techniques here, he murmured, running his hand along the tunnel wall. Standard Victorian brickwork, but notice these irregularities, sections where the mortar appears to have been recently disturbed and replaced. The Chamber of Echoes. At the convergence of 3 passages directly beneath Baker Street proper, we entered a chamber where the works of modern London met the bones of the ancient city in uneasy conjunction. The brick arch above us was of recent construction, but one wall consisted of blocks so weathered they appeared almost rounded, set with a craftsmanship that predated Victorian engineering by centuries. Holmes immediately began his peculiar crab-like examination of the chamber, lantern in one hand and magnifying glass in the other. He did not merely look, he palpated the brick, breathed upon the mortar, and even held his violin bow lightly against the wall to detect vibrations beyond human hearing. Fascinating, he murmured, crouching to examine the floor with minute attention. Watson, note these boot prints. Size 9, well-worn sole, not the heavy, hobnailed boots of railway labourers. More refined, perhaps a gentleman's walking boot. He moved to the wall, scraping carefully with his penknife. And here, magnesium residue. Someone has burned magnesium ribbon here within the last week. an intense, smokeless light, an engineer's flare, or perhaps a photographer's. Professor Thornfield, examining a section of ancient stonework, called our attention to a series of carved symbols barely visible beneath centuries of grime. "These markings," he said, adjusting his spectacles. "They match the descriptions in Blackwood's journal. 7 pointed stars arranged in a precise geometric pattern, radiating from a central point." Holmes produced a small sample of discolored earth from a crevice in the wall, sealing it carefully in a glass vial. "Not common London clay, Watson. This has a higher iron content, and there's an organic trace consistent with deep earth fungi, exactly what Blackwood described finding in the sealed chambers." The voice from beyond. "Gentlemen," Holmes announced, positioning his recording equipment at strategic points throughout the chamber, "I require absolute silence. Watson, please time our vigil precisely." We stood in complete stillness, the only sounds our own breathing and the distant rumble of late-night train traffic. At 17 minutes past midnight, the silence shattered. The voice came not as an echo or distant call, but as if someone stood directly beside us, speaking through the solid stone itself. Clear, educated English, with a slight Welsh accent that carried an unmistakable note of authority and menace. "The foundation stones remember what was buried beneath," the voice intoned with chilling clarity. "7 seals were placed, 7 guardians chosen, 7 deaths required. The covenant must be fulfilled, or London shall sink into the earth that spawned it." Holmes remained perfectly motionless, his recording device capturing every word, while his keen eyes searched for any sign of the voice's source. The sound seemed to emanate from multiple points simultaneously, as if distributed throughout the tunnel system itself. "Holmes," the voice continued, and I felt my blood run cold at hearing my friend's name spoken by this unseen presence. "You seek truth in shadows, but some shadows were meant to remain undisturbed. The 7th seal weakens. 3 days remain before it breaks entirely, and what was bound below rises to reclaim what was stolen." As if summoned by these words, a subtle vibration ran through the tunnel walls, lasting perhaps 10 seconds before fading to nothing. Holmes's instruments registered the disturbance, their needles dancing frantically before returning to rest. The hidden mechanism. The silence that followed was absolute and oppressive. Holmes waited a full 5 minutes before moving, his instruments having detected no further acoustic anomalies. When he finally spoke, his voice carried grim satisfaction. "Remarkable engineering," he murmured, examining his recordings. "Watson, we are dealing with someone of considerable technical sophistication, someone who has mastered the acoustic properties of London's underground network." He moved to a section of wall where the mortar appeared slightly different in hue, producing a slender steel probe flattened like a leaf at one end. With delicate precision, he tapped along the joints until the note dulled at one particular point. Pressing carefully, something yielded with a tiny sigh, and a brick-length section of mortar loosened and came away. Behind it lay not solid earth, but a narrow copper tube, scarcely wider than a quill, running obliquely into the ancient stonework. "A resonating tube, Watson, adjusted to the acoustic frequencies native to this corridor. See the silk diaphragm at the mouth. It amplifies and directs sound with remarkable precision." But this was not the end of our discoveries. Holmes's probe had revealed something more significant. The entire section of wall was a carefully constructed facade. "Gentlemen," he announced, producing a small chisel from his equipment bag, "we have found our speaker's true hiding place." With methodical precision, he began to chip away at the mortar surrounding the carved symbols. Within moments, his chisel encountered not solid brick, but empty space, a carefully concealed opening that extended into darkness beyond our lamplight. "A false wall," Professor Thornfield breathed, his scholarly excitement overcoming his apprehension. "Blackwood's sealed chambers. They were never truly sealed at all, merely hidden." Holmes smiled grimly as he examined the concealed entrance. The voice may utilize mechanical amplification, but its source is decidedly human. And I suspect we shall find far more than acoustic trickery when we explore what lies beyond this threshold. The chamber fell silent once more, but it was no longer the silence of mystery. It was the silence of anticipation. We had found the gateway to whatever secrets lay buried beneath London's foundations, and tomorrow night we would cross that threshold to confront the truth behind the voice under Baker Street. The game, as Holmes was fond of saying, was most decidedly afoot. The grey November dawn found us in our familiar sitting room, the detritus of our nocturnal investigation, spread across Holmes's chemical bench like the components of some arcane ritual. Mrs. Hudson had provided coffee of unusual strength, clearly recognizing the signs of one of her tenant's more intensive cases, while Holmes himself moved between his microscope and recording apparatus with the methodical precision of a surgeon dissecting a particularly complex specimen. "Watson," he began, adjusting the focus on his lens, "our subterranean friend has provided us with several illuminating clues, though I suspect not all were intentional." He gestured toward a small sample of reddish clay sealed in a glass vial. "This earth from the concealed chamber contains traces of Portland cement, a substance not introduced to London construction until the 1870s, 7 years after Blackwood's supposed disappearance." I leaned forward to examine the sample more closely. "Then someone has been maintaining access to these chambers for decades." "Precisely. More revealing still is this acoustic analysis." Holmes produced his phonographic recordings from the previous evening, the wax cylinder gleaming dully in the morning light. Note the speaker's pronunciation, educated Welsh accent, but with specific regional characteristics. The way he enunciates covenant and foundation suggests origins in the mining districts of South Wales, where acoustic engineering was essential for underground communication. Professor Thornfield, who had remained for our morning consultation, consulted his leather-bound notebook. "Holmes, there's something else that troubles me. The 7-pointed stars we observed. I've encountered similar symbols in the archives of mining companies. They were used as warnings about dangerous excavations or unstable ground conditions." Lestrade's triumph. Our analysis was interrupted by the familiar sound of Inspector Lestrade's brisk footsteps upon our stairs. He entered with an air of satisfaction that immediately put Holmes on guard, for experience had taught us that Lestrade's confidence often preceded his most spectacular oversights. "Gentlemen," he announced, producing a set of official documents from his coat, "I believe we have our man. Ever heard of the Society of the Seventh Seal?" Holmes's grey eyes sharpened with interest. "A spiritualist organization, judging by the name. Speak plainly, Lestrade." "A theatrical concern in Fitzrovia, led by one Reverend Silas Mortlake, though whether he's truly ordained is questionable. Born in Carmarthenshire, speaks with precisely the Welsh accent you described. He's been conducting what he calls foundational seances, claiming to commune with the very stones of London." Lestrade unfolded a lurid handbill. "The Society of the Seventh Seal. Hear the earth speak, the foundation stones. Remember. Reverend Silas Mortlake, conductor of harmonious vibrations. We raided his premises at dawn," Lestrade continued with evident pride. "Found copper tubing, silk diaphragms, a precision lathe for drawing wire, and enough magnesium ribbon to illuminate Westminster Abbey. More damning still, he possessed detailed maps of the Metropolitan Railway, with the Tyburn culvert marked in red ink, and boots, size 9, with heel wear matching exactly the prints you discovered beneath Baker Street." Holmes rose and began his characteristic pacing before the fireplace. "Most illuminating, Lestrade. And Mortlake's explanation for this incriminating evidence? Claims it's all for legitimate spiritual research, says he's trying to prove that sound can carry the memory of historical events through underground channels. Pure nonsense, of course. But he maintains his innocence with remarkable conviction. The underground laboratory. Despite Lestrade's apparent success, Holmes insisted upon returning to the concealed chamber beneath Baker Street, this time with proper excavation equipment. What we discovered there validated both Lestrade's findings and Holmes's suspicions in equal measure. The hidden passage, once fully opened, revealed not merely a hiding place, but an elaborate underground laboratory. The chamber had been expanded and reinforced with modern engineering techniques, creating a workspace that combined Victorian ingenuity with almost scientific precision. A sophisticated acoustic apparatus dominated the center of the room, copper tubes of varying lengths arranged like the pipes of an organ, connected to a complex system of resonating chambers and amplification devices. "Observe the craftsmanship, Watson," Holmes murmured, examining the apparatus with his magnifying glass. "This is not the work of an amateur spiritualist seeking to create simple tricks. The mathematical precision required for these acoustic calculations suggests someone with formal engineering training." Scattered throughout the chamber were personal effects that painted a compelling picture of the occupant's identity and motivations. A well-worn pipe emitted the distinctive aroma of expensive Latakia tobacco. Engineering manuals lay open beside detailed diagrams of London's underground network. Most significantly, a leather-bound journal contained extensive notes about Cornelius Blackwood's original discoveries, written in the same precise hand that had marked the railway maps found in Mortlake's possession. "Here, gentlemen," Professor Thornfield announced from a corner of the chamber, "we have what appears to be Mortlake's inspiration." He held up a collection of newspaper clippings from 1863 and 1864, detailing the mysterious deaths of the 7 railway workers whose names the voice had called. Marginal notes in the same handwriting expressed outrage at the corporate conspiracy that had supposedly covered up their murders. Holmes's reservations. Yet even as the evidence mounted against Mortlake, I observed that peculiar stillness that came over Holmes when a case appeared too perfectly resolved. He examined each piece of evidence with unusual care, his long fingers tracing the edges of documents, and his grey eyes noting details that escaped the rest of us. "Tell me, Lestrade," he said finally, "when you arrested Mortlake, did he offer any resistance?" "None whatsoever. Seemed almost relieved, if you ask me. Kept muttering about forces beyond his control, and how he'd done what was necessary to warn London." Holmes nodded thoughtfully, but I detected a note of dissatisfaction in his expression. "And his explanation for knowing my name specifically?" "Claims he's followed your cases in the newspapers. Says he chose to invoke your name because he knew it would ensure serious investigation of his warnings." Lestrade shrugged. "Seems plausible enough." "Indeed," Holmes murmured, though his tone suggested anything but agreement. As we prepared to leave the underground chamber, Holmes paused at the acoustic apparatus, running his fingers along one of the copper tubes with an almost reverent touch. "Watson," he said quietly, "when a case presents itself with such convenient completeness, I am inclined to look for the hand that arranged the convenience. You suspect Mortlake is not our true adversary. I suspect, my dear fellow, that Reverend Silas Mortlake may be as much a victim of this conspiracy as those 7 railway workers whose deaths he seeks to avenge." Holmes's eyes gleamed with that familiar light that indicated his mind was working several moves ahead of the apparent facts. "The voice under Baker Street has been silenced, but I fear the true danger to London has only just begun to reveal itself." The gathering storm. That evening, as London celebrated the capture of the underground voice in banner headlines across every newspaper, Holmes sat by our window with his violin across his knees, the bow idle in his fingers. The case that had seemed so neatly resolved now felt like the opening movement of a far more complex symphony. "Watson," he said at last, his voice carrying that tone which warned me that greater mysteries lay ahead. "We have caught a man who could make the voice speak. Now we must discover who gave it the words to say, and what those words were truly meant to accomplish." In the distance, barely audible above the sounds of London evening, came the faint rumble of underground trains carrying their passengers through tunnels that suddenly seemed far less secure than they had that morning. The game, as Holmes was fond of saying, was entering its most dangerous phase. The The morning editions of November's End proclaimed London's deliverance with the unanimous enthusiasm of a grateful populace. Underground voice silenced, trumpeted the Times, while the Standard declared, "Railway rogue unmasked." Inspector Lestrade had called upon us early, his satisfaction evident in every gesture as he accepted our congratulations with uncharacteristic humility, attributing the success entirely to Scotland Yard's methodical police work. Yet, even as London celebrated its return to subterranean tranquility, I observed that peculiar stillness that came over Holmes when a case appeared too neatly resolved. He sat in his favourite armchair, the morning papers scattered at his feet like discarded theatre programmes, his grey eyes fixed not upon the headlines proclaiming victory, but upon the small collection of evidence arranged with mathematical precision across his chemical bench. "Watson," he said at length, his voice carrying that tone of quiet scepticism that I had learned to recognise as the prelude to deeper investigation. When a puzzle presents itself with such convenient completeness, I am invariably compelled to examine the hand that arranged the convenience. The evidence speaks. Holmes rose and moved to his workbench, where Mortlake's confiscated effects lay displayed like specimens in a natural history museum. He selected Blackwood's journal first, opening it to a page marked with his own precise annotations. "Observe these marginalia, Watson. Undoubtedly Mortlake's hand, as confirmed by Scotland Yard's experts. Yet note the ink." He held the page toward the window, where the weak November light revealed subtle variations in the text. While appearing aged, this ink possesses a chemical composition that suggests formulation no earlier than 5 years past. Mortlake's annotations are recent additions to a genuinely historical document. He turned to a specific passage where Blackwood's original text referenced the true seal and the seventh key. Mortlake's annotation beside it read simply, "The prophecy fulfilled by the voice." Too literal, Watson. Mortlake interprets complex Victorian symbolism as if reading a penny dreadful. His understanding lacks the sophisticated grasp of engineering metaphor that Blackwood employed. Holmes set the journal aside and lifted the brass medallion, examining it through his magnifying glass. And this curious artifact presents even more intriguing contradictions. The medallion's secret. Holmes produced a small, precision-crafted compass from his vest pocket, placing its needlepoint into the central indentation of the seven-pointed star. With a subtle adjustment, the compass needle aligned not with magnetic north, but with one specific point of the star, which corresponded to a microscopic glyph etched into the medallion's edge. A directional indicator, Watson, not mystical symbolism. This glyph combines Greek letters, alpha and omega intertwined with a stylized P, forming a personal cipher rather than occult markings. Holmes's eyes gleamed with intellectual satisfaction. Someone wished us to find this medallion, but they also embedded within it information intended for a more discerning observer. I leaned closer to examine the tiny markings. But if Mortlake didn't create this, who did? And why allow him to be captured with such damning evidence? The superior hand. Holmes moved to his chemical apparatus, where a minute fragment of metal dissolved slowly in acid. This sample, scraped from the interior of Mortlake's acoustic device, is not copper or brass, but an alloy containing rare metallic components prized for exceptional acoustic properties. Such materials are extraordinarily expensive and require advanced metallurgical knowledge to work properly. He gestured toward a detailed sketch of the underground laboratory's acoustic apparatus. Mortlake's workshop possessed functional tools, Watson, but lacked the precision instruments necessary to create components of this sophistication. He was the operator, not the architect, of this elaborate deception. A visit to Pentonville. That afternoon brought an urgent message from Pentonville Prison. Mortlake had requested an interview, claiming vital information about the true nature of the conspiracy. We found him in his cell, not dying as some accounts might suggest, but clearly a man labouring under tremendous psychological strain. Mr. Holmes, he began without preamble, I must tell you what I dared not reveal to Inspector Lestrade. I am not the author of this scheme. I am merely its most recent instrument. Holmes settled into the single chair, his manner encouraging but alert. Then tell us, Reverend Mortlake, who provided you with the words the voice spoke, and why you agreed to become their mouthpiece. The puppet master revealed. Mortlake's account painted a picture of careful manipulation extending back several months. A gentleman of evident education and wealth had approached him, claiming to represent descendants of the original railway investors. This mysterious benefactor possessed intimate knowledge of Mortlake's acoustic research and his family's tragic connection to Welsh mining disasters. He called himself Alderton, claimed his great-uncle was among the 7 murdered workers, said he had inherited documents proving a deliberate conspiracy to weaken London's foundations, but needed my expertise to warn the city without exposing himself to similar danger. Mortlake's hands trembled slightly as he spoke. The payment was generous. Gold sovereigns from the Bank of Pemberton and North, old coins, but newly minted. Holmes's eyes sharpened with interest. Describe this Mr. Alderton, if you please. Tall gentleman, perhaps 6 feet, with prematurely grey hair and educated London speech, though occasionally he lapsed into what sounded like colonial inflection. South African, I believe. He carried an ebony walking stick, topped with silver shaped like a surveyor's transit, and wore a distinctive ring, gold, with 7 small diamonds arranged in a star pattern. The true design. The voice's words were his composition, not mine, Mortlake continued. He provided written scripts on fine paper that would not accept common ink, but I began to suspect his true motives when he insisted that certain specific buildings be mentioned in the warnings: the Bank of England, Parliament, St. Paul's Cathedral, all constructed directly above the Tyburn's original course. Holmes rose and began pacing the narrow confines of the cell. A target list, disguised as historical research. Most illuminating. And when did you realize you had outlived your usefulness? When he visited me here, the night before your raid on my premises. Brought tea to calm my nerves, he said, though it carried a slightly bitter taste beneath the honey. I should have recognized the symptoms. They match precisely those described in Blackwood's account of the 7 workers' deaths. The larger game. Holmes consulted his pocket watch, his expression growing increasingly grave. Watson, we must return immediately to Baker Street. If Mortlake speaks truly, then we face an adversary who combines technical sophistication with historical knowledge and considerable financial resources. The voice under Baker Street was merely the opening gambit in a far more complex game. As we prepared to leave, Holmes turned back to Mortlake with something approaching sympathy. You will be safer here than anywhere else in London, Reverend. Whatever Mr. Alderton's ultimate design, he clearly prefers his instruments silenced once they have served their purpose. The gathering storm. That evening found us in our familiar sitting room, but the comfortable atmosphere had been replaced by a sense of impending crisis. Holmes sat by the window with his violin across his knees, though the bow remained idle in his fingers as he gazed out at the fog-shrouded street below. Watson, he said at length, we have been drawn into a conspiracy that began 30 years ago with 7 murdered railway workers and continues today with sophisticated acoustic deception and carefully orchestrated misdirection. Our mysterious Mr. Alderton possesses the resources to manipulate evidence, the knowledge to exploit London's underground vulnerabilities, and the ruthlessness to eliminate anyone who threatens his design. But what is his ultimate objective, Holmes? Surely not mere theatrical effect. Holmes rose and moved to his map of London's underground network, his finger tracing the route of the old Tyburn River. Consider the buildings he specifically targeted in his warnings, Watson. The financial heart of the empire, the seat of government, the spiritual centre of Anglican England. If he truly possesses the ability to flood the chambers beneath these structures, he holds the power to bring the British Empire to its knees. The fog swirled past our windows like ghostly fingers, and somewhere in the distance came the rumble of underground trains carrying their passengers through tunnels that suddenly seemed far less secure than they had that morning. The voice under Baker Street had been silenced, but its echoes would soon reverberate through the corridors of power in ways we were only beginning to comprehend. "The game, Watson, has entered its most dangerous phase," Holmes murmured, his grey eyes reflecting the gaslight with predatory intensity. "And I suspect that before it ends, we shall discover that the true threat to London lies not in ancient curses or supernatural voices, but in the very human capacity for greed, revenge, and the manipulation of fear itself." In the gathering darkness of late November, with fewer than 5 days remaining in the month, we prepared to confront an adversary whose identity remained hidden, but whose capabilities were becoming terrifyingly clear. The foundation stones of London might indeed remember what was buried beneath, but someone was determined to ensure that those memories would serve purposes far removed from historical justice. The pale November dawn brought news that struck like a physical blow to our investigation. Mrs. Hudson's face bore the gravity of unwelcome tidings as she delivered the official telegram that would reshape our understanding of the conspiracy we faced. "Mortlake expired. 5:47 a.m. Sudden cardiac arrest. Prison surgeon reports no suspicious circumstances. Arrangements for burial proceeding." Pentonville. Governor Holmes read the message once, his grey eyes scanning the terse official language with that peculiar stillness that marked his most intense mental activity. When he looked up, his expression carried the grim satisfaction of a man whose darkest suspicions had been confirmed. "Poison, Watson. A subtle compound, administered gradually to ensure the symptoms would appear natural. Our Reverend Mortlake knew too much, and someone ensured his silence would be permanent." He folded the telegram with deliberate precision. "The question now becomes, what information died with him, and what urgent action prompted such decisive elimination?" The Threadneedle Street incident. Our answer arrived within the hour, delivered by a breathless messenger from the Metropolitan Railway Company. Mr. Hartwell burst into our sitting room with his usual composure entirely abandoned, his face bearing the pallor of a man who had witnessed something that challenged his fundamental understanding of structural engineering. "Holmes, Dr. Watson, there has been a catastrophic incident at the Bank of England. A section of the sub-basement has suffered sudden flooding, and the circumstances are unprecedented." He paused to catch his breath, his engineer's mind clearly struggling to process what he had observed. The water came from below, through solid bedrock that should have been impermeable. More disturbing still, witnesses reported hearing that familiar voice moments before the deluge began. Holmes was already reaching for his coat and investigative equipment. "The escalation begins. Watson, bring your medical bag. I suspect we shall find evidence of more than structural failure." Beneath the bank's foundations, the scene that greeted us beneath the Bank of England defied conventional explanation. In a vault corridor whose walls consisted of massive stone blocks dating to the building's original construction, water had erupted through what appeared to be solid masonry, flooding the passage to a depth of several inches before drainage systems could contain the flow. Holmes approached the investigation with his characteristic methodical precision, examining every detail with the intensity of a surgeon dissecting a particularly complex specimen. His magnifying glass revealed minute traces of copper filings embedded in the mortar between stones, while his chemical testing apparatus detected residues that spoke of deliberate sabotage rather than natural structural failure. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, indicating a barely visible aperture concealed within the shadow of an ancient moulding. A copper tube, precisely fitted and recently installed. The workmanship is superior to Mortlake's crude apparatus. This represents the hand of a master craftsman. He scraped a sample of white residue from the stone surface, sealing it carefully in a glass vial. Eucalyptus oil, used to mask the metallic scent of fresh copper work, combined with traces of camel hair, the lining of a precision instrument case. Our antagonist maintains his equipment with the care of a professional engineer. The pattern emerges, As Holmes continued his examination, the true sophistication of the attack became apparent. The flooding had been precisely controlled, designed to demonstrate capability rather than cause maximum damage. The water had risen to exactly the level necessary to trigger the bank's emergency protocols without threatening the main vault or causing structural collapse. A warning, Watson, delivered with surgical precision. Someone wishes to demonstrate their ability to strike at the heart of Britain's financial system while maintaining complete deniability. Holmes consulted his pocket watch, his expression growing increasingly grave. The timing coincides perfectly with Mortlake's death, one source of information silenced just as another form of communication begins. Inspector Lestrade arrived as we completed our initial investigation, his usual confidence tempered by the obvious inadequacy of conventional police methods in addressing such technical sabotage. Holmes, what are we dealing with here? My men can secure the area, but this is beyond ordinary criminal investigation. We face an adversary who combines intimate knowledge of London's underground vulnerabilities with the resources and expertise to exploit them systematically, Holmes replied. The voice under Baker Street was merely the opening movement of a far more complex symphony of destruction. The Pemberton Revelation. Our investigation led us through the narrow streets of the financial district to the offices of Pemberton and North, the private banking concern from which Mortlake's mysterious gold sovereigns had been drawn. The senior partner, Mr. Cornelius Pemberton, received us with the cautious courtesy of a man who recognized that his institution's discretion was about to be tested by circumstances beyond normal commercial considerations. Pemberton proved to be a gentleman of perhaps 70 years, his silver hair and careful manner speaking of decades spent managing the financial affairs of London's most influential families. When Holmes presented the evidence linking his bank to the underground conspiracy, the banker's composure remained intact, though I observed a subtle tightening around his eyes that suggested personal knowledge of the matters under discussion. Mr. Holmes, the transaction you reference was indeed conducted through our offices, though the circumstances were unusual. Pemberton moved to a portrait gallery that dominated one wall of his office, stopping before a daguerreotype of a stern-faced Victorian gentleman. This is my grandfather, the original Cornelius Pemberton, who founded this bank to finance large-scale engineering projects. His particular expertise lay in the infrastructure that transformed London into the modern metropolis. He indicated another portrait, showing a younger man with the weathered complexion of outdoor labour. And this is Thomas Pemberton, my grandfather's brother, who served as chief surveyor for the Metropolitan Railway Company's 7th Division. He disappeared in November of 1863, along with his supervisor, Cornelius Blackwood. Holmes leaned forward with predatory interest. Then your family possesses direct historical connection to the original railway construction and the 7 murdered workers. More than connection, Mr. Holmes. We were instrumental in its financing and execution. The client you seek is my own great-nephew, Marcus Alderton Pemberton, who inherited both his grandfather's engineering knowledge and his grandfather's grievances. The engineer's obsession. Pemberton's account revealed a pattern of family tragedy extending across generations. Marcus had emigrated to South Africa in his youth, establishing himself as a mining engineer of considerable reputation before returning to London the previous year with substantial wealth and an obsessive interest in his family's historical involvement with the underground railway system. He claimed to have discovered evidence that his grandfather Thomas had been murdered to prevent him from revealing structural defects in the tunnel construction, defects that could potentially flood large sections of central London if exploited by someone with sufficient engineering expertise. Pemberton withdrew a collection of documents from a secure drawer, his hands trembling slightly as he revealed the extent of his great-nephew's preparations. The papers bore Marcus Pemberton's handwriting in margins filled with calculations involving water pressure, structural load limits, and timetables coordinated with specific dates in late November. Holmes examined the documents with his magnifying glass, his expression growing increasingly grave as the true scope of the threat became apparent. These are not theoretical exercises, Watson, but practical engineering specifications. Marcus Pemberton has spent months calculating the precise points where simultaneous flooding could create cascading failure throughout London's underground network. He indicated a detailed calendar marked with cryptic notations. November 30th, the anniversary of Thomas Pemberton's disappearance, is circled in red ink and annotated with "Foundation stones remember. Covenant fulfilled. The race against time." As we prepare to leave Pemberton's office, Holmes turned back with quiet urgency. Where would your great-nephew establish his base of operations? He requires access to the underground network, sophisticated equipment, and complete privacy for his preparations. Pemberton consulted a property register with obvious reluctance. The family owns a warehouse in Suffolk, near London Bridge. It was Thomas's original workshop, connected to the tunnel system through maintenance passages that predate modern security measures. If Marcus intended to access the underground network without detection, that would be his most logical choice. The gathering storm. The fog had returned by the time we emerged from the bank, transforming London's familiar streets into a maze of shadows and uncertainty. Holmes hailed a hansom cab with unusual urgency, his mind clearly racing ahead to the confrontation that awaited us. "Watson," he said as our cab rattled through the narrow streets, "we face an adversary who combines intimate knowledge of London's vulnerabilities with the resources and determination to exploit them. Marcus Pemberton is not merely seeking revenge for historical injustices, he is attempting to demonstrate that the British Empire itself rests upon foundations as fragile as the tunnels beneath our feet." He consulted his pocket watch, his expression carrying that peculiar mixture of intellectual excitement and genuine concern that marked his most challenging cases. "We have less than 48 hours to prevent what appears to be a coordinated attack on London's underground infrastructure." The voice under Baker Street was merely the overture. The true symphony of destruction is about to begin. The clip-clop of our horses' hooves echoed through the fog-shrouded streets like a countdown to catastrophe, while somewhere ahead of us, in the darkness beneath London Bridge, an engineer's obsession with the past was preparing to reshape the future in ways that would test the very foundations of our civilization. The game had entered its most dangerous phase, and the stakes had never been higher. The November fog had thickened to an almost tangible presence by the time our hansom deposited us near London Bridge, transforming the industrial landscape of Southwark into a maze of spectral shapes and muffled echoes. Holmes had spent the journey in one of his periods of intense cerebration, his long fingers drumming against his knee, while his grey eyes remained fixed upon some invisible calculation in the middle distance. "Watson," he said at length, as we approached the weathered brick facade of the Pemberton warehouse, "observe how our adversary has chosen his ground. This structure predates the Metropolitan Railway construction by a decade, yet stands precisely at the convergence of three ancient watercourses. Not coincidence, but careful selection, based upon geological advantages that few would recognize. The building presented an appearance of abandonment to casual observation, its windows painted black and its entrance secured with what appeared to be rusted chains. Yet Holmes's trained eye detected subtle signs of recent occupation, the faint electrical glow escaping through hairline cracks in the painted glass, the absence of accumulated debris around the doorways, and the telltale wear patterns on the cobblestones that spoke of regular, carefully concealed traffic. The underground laboratory. Holmes's lock-picking instruments proved unnecessary, for we discovered that the warehouse's side entrance stood slightly ajar, revealing a narrow corridor that disappeared into absolute darkness beyond our lantern's reach. The interior had been transformed into something that combined the precision of a surveyor's office with the technical sophistication of an engineering laboratory. Gas lamps, suspended from reinforced ceiling beams, cast brilliant pools of light over workbenches equipped with instruments that spoke of considerable investment in specialized equipment. Maps of London's underground network covered every available wall surface, marked with colored pins and annotations in Marcus Pemberton's precise engineering hand. At the center of the workspace stood a three-dimensional model of central London, constructed with extraordinary detail, showing not merely the surface streets, but the complete network of tunnels, sewers, and culverts that lay beneath. Magnificent and terrifying in equal measure, Holmes murmured, examining the model with his magnifying glass. Observe, Watson, how the coloured threads connect specific points. The Bank of England, Parliament, St. Paul's Cathedral, the Royal Exchange. Each thread represents a calculated point of structural vulnerability, and the web they form encompasses the very heart of the empire. Holmes discovered Marcus Pemberton's operational journal lying open upon the main workbench, its pages filled with calculations and timetables that revealed months of meticulous preparation. The entries, written in the precise hand of a trained engineer, detailed not merely the locations of his intended targets, but the exact hydraulic pressures required to exploit the structural weaknesses he had identified in London's underground foundations. The true mechanism revealed. Moving deeper into the warehouse, we descended through a concealed stairway into a subterranean chamber that represented the true heart of Pemberton's operation. Here, beneath the streets of Southwark, he had constructed a sophisticated hydraulic system centered around a massive brass and steel pump whose gleaming surfaces reflected our lantern light with almost hypnotic intensity. The voice under Baker Street was merely the overture, Watson, Holmes observed, tracing the network of reinforced pipes that snaked away into the darkness. This apparatus represents the true symphony of destruction, a hydraulic system designed to create precisely controlled surges of water pressure through London's ancient culvert network. Holmes examined a series of pneumatic tubes running along the chamber walls, terminating in a central control panel equipped with 7 distinct valve mechanisms. Here we discover the true meaning of the 7 seals referenced in our underground voice. Not mystical pronouncements, but a sequence of hydraulic valves designed to be opened in precise order, each one increasing the pressure on specific sections of the underground network until catastrophic failure becomes inevitable. The counter-strategy. As Holmes continued his examination of Pemberton's apparatus, I observed that peculiar stillness that came over him when formulating his most complex strategies. He moved between the various components of the hydraulic system with the methodical precision of a chess master studying a particularly challenging position. The beauty of this design, Watson, lies not merely in its technical sophistication, but in its psychological impact. By creating the illusion of supernatural manifestation, Pemberton has ensured that any investigation would focus upon spiritualist explanations rather than engineering realities. Holmes paused at the central control panel, his keen eyes cataloguing the arrangement of valves and pressure gauges. However, every system designed to create controlled destruction can be turned to controlled prevention, provided one understands the underlying principles. Holmes began making subtle adjustments to several of the valve mechanisms, his movements so precise that they appeared almost surgical in their delicacy. I am not disabling his apparatus, Watson, but rather preparing to redirect its force. When Pemberton attempts to fulfill his covenant with the foundation stones, he will discover that his carefully calculated pressures have been channeled into harmless dispersion rather than destructive concentration. The unexpected revelation. Our work was interrupted by the sound of footsteps echoing from the warehouse above, followed by voices engaged in what appeared to be urgent consultation. Holmes immediately extinguished our lanterns, plunging us into absolute darkness while he guided me to a position behind the massive hydraulic pump where we could observe without being detected. 2 figures descended into the chamber, their conversation revealing details that would fundamentally alter our understanding of the conspiracy we faced. The first voice belonged unmistakably to Marcus Pemberton, his colonial accent carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. The second voice, however, proved to be far more shocking in its familiarity. "The final preparations must be completed tonight," came Professor Thornfield's measured tones, though now carrying an undertone of urgency that had been absent during our previous encounters. Holmes's investigation has proceeded more rapidly than anticipated, and we can know, longer rely upon misdirection to conceal our activities. Then we accelerate the timetable, Pemberton replied with grim determination. The hydraulic charges are in position, the pressure calculations are complete, and the pneumatic triggers are calibrated for simultaneous activation. Whether we have 36 hours or 36 minutes, the covenant will be fulfilled. Holmes's strategic revelation. From our concealment, Holmes whispered with barely audible satisfaction. Most illuminating, Watson. Our scholarly Professor Thornfield has revealed himself as considerably more than a passive antiquarian. His expertise in Victorian archaeological discoveries was not merely academic curiosity, but professional reconnaissance for this elaborate scheme. As Thornfield and Pemberton moved about the chamber, checking various components of their apparatus, Holmes continued his whispered analysis. Observe how naturally the professor navigates this technical environment, Watson. His knowledge of London's underground history was not gleaned from dusty archives, but from direct participation in its modern exploitation. Holmes waited until our adversaries had completed their inspection and returned to the warehouse above before emerging from concealment. The trap is now perfectly baited, Watson. They believe their secret remains secure, while we possess complete knowledge of their methods and timetable. Tomorrow evening, when they attempt to activate their 7 seals, they will discover that their foundation stones remember rather different lessons than those they intended to teach. The gathering storm. As we prepared to leave the underground chamber, Holmes made several additional adjustments to Pemberton's control mechanisms, his movements guided by calculations that remained opaque to my understanding, but clearly represented the culmination of his strategic planning. Watson, he said as we ascended toward the warehouse proper, we have discovered not merely the mechanism of their revenge, but the psychology that drives it. Pemberton and Thornfield represent 2 different forms of historical obsession: the engineer who seeks to rebuild the past through destruction of the present, and the scholar who believes that ancient grievances justify modern catastrophe. The fog swirled through the warehouse windows like ghostly fingers as we made our final preparations to leave, and somewhere beneath our feet, the modified hydraulic apparatus waited to transform an act of vengeance into an instrument of salvation. Holmes had set his countertrap with characteristic precision, but the final moves of this deadly game remained to be played. Tomorrow evening, Watson, we shall discover whether the foundation stones of London remember justice or merely revenge. The voice under Baker Street has been silenced, but the true symphony of this conspiracy has yet to reach its crescendo. The November night pressed against us with the weight of impending crisis, and in less than 24 hours, the fate of London would be determined by the clash between an engineer's obsession with the past and a detective's dedication to preserving the future. The game had entered its most perilous phase, where the stakes extended far beyond individual lives to encompass the very survival of the empire itself. The morning of November 30th found Holmes in a state of controlled intensity that I had witnessed only during his most critical cases. Our sitting room had been transformed into something resembling a military command centre, with maps of London's underground network spread across every available surface, marked with coloured threads that traced the hydraulic connections Pemberton had established between his Suffolk laboratory and the vulnerable points beneath the city's most vital structures. Holmes had spent the pre-dawn hours in preparation that combined scientific precision with strategic cunning. His chemical apparatus occupied one corner, where he had prepared several compounds whose purpose would soon become clear. Most notably, he had synthesized a quantity of fluorescin, an aniline dye that glowed with brilliant green luminescence when introduced to water, a substance that would prove crucial to his counter-strategy. "Watson," he said, consulting his pocket watch with characteristic precision, "today we shall discover whether 30 years of careful planning can be undone by superior understanding of hydraulic principles. Pemberton's design is elegant in its simplicity. 7 pressure points activated in sequence to create cascading failures throughout London's underground network. However, every hydraulic system operates according to immutable physical laws, and I have taken considerable care to ensure that those laws serve preservation rather than destruction. The underground convergence. As evening approached, Holmes and I descended through a maintenance entrance near the Royal Exchange, accompanied by Inspector Lestrade and a carefully selected team of constables. Holmes had insisted upon bringing his complete arsenal of scientific equipment, including acoustic detection devices and the precious vials of fluorescin that would serve as our early warning system. The tunnels beneath the Royal Exchange represented a convergence of London's underground arteries, where Roman foundations met Victorian engineering in an archaeological testament to the city's enduring strength. Here, in chambers that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, Pemberton and Thornfield had chosen to stage their demonstration of power over the modern world. We found them waiting in a circular chamber whose walls bore the carved symbols we had observed beneath Baker Street, though here they were accompanied by the sophisticated hydraulic apparatus that represented months of meticulous installation. Professor Thornfield, or should I say, the man who had masqueraded as a scholarly antiquarian while serving as Pemberton's co-conspirator, stood beside a control panel whose 7 brass valves gleamed like the keys of some infernal organ. "Mr. Holmes," Thornfield called out with scholarly satisfaction, though his facade of academic detachment had finally cracked to reveal the calculating mind beneath. "How gratifying that you chose to accept our invitation. You arrive at precisely the moment when theory transforms into practical demonstration." The revelation of the true conspiracy. Marcus Pemberton stepped forward, his colonial accent carrying the authority of a man accustomed to command in dangerous situations. His tall frame and prematurely grey hair matched perfectly the description Mortlake had provided of the mysterious Mr. Alderton, and the ebony walking stick topped with silver surveyor's instruments confirmed his true identity beyond doubt. "Sherlock Holmes," he declared with grim satisfaction, "the great detective who believes that logic can unravel any mystery. Tonight you will discover that some forces transcend rational analysis, that the foundation stones of London remember their buried secrets, and that those secrets demand justice." Holmes approached with apparent casualness, though I observed the subtle tension in his shoulders that indicated readiness for immediate action. "Marcus Pemberton, mining engineer and descendant of Thomas Pemberton, whose death you seek to avenge through the systematic destruction of London's underground infrastructure. Your technical expertise is impressive, though your understanding of historical justice appears somewhat limited." He gestured toward the hydraulic apparatus with professional interest. "This represents months of meticulous preparation. 7 hydraulic charges, positioned at calculated points of structural vulnerability, connected by a pneumatic control system that would allow simultaneous activation from this central location. The voice under Baker Street was merely the overture to this symphony of destruction, designed to create an atmosphere of supernatural dread while concealing the very human engineering that would make your revenge possible. The counter-strategy revealed. "However," Holmes continued, producing a small brass key from his vest pocket, "every hydraulic system requires pressure relief mechanisms to prevent catastrophic overpressurization. While you were installing your charges, I took the liberty of installing my own modifications to your carefully crafted network." Pemberton's confidence faltered as Holmes inserted his key into a concealed mechanism I had not previously noticed, built into the ancient stonework itself. "Impossible. This system has been under constant surveillance." "By you and Professor Thornfield, certainly," Holmes replied with quiet satisfaction. "But you failed to account for the possibility that your surveillance itself was being observed. During our previous visit to your Southwark laboratory, I noted the precise specifications of your hydraulic system and took the precaution of installing countermeasures at strategic points throughout the network." Holmes turned the key with deliberate precision, and immediately the pressure gauges began registering dramatic changes in the hydraulic system's operating parameters. "You see, gentlemen, while you focused upon the destructive potential of concentrated hydraulic pressure, I redirected your forces into constructive reinforcement of the very structures you sought to undermine. The trap springs. Professor Thornfield rushed to his control panel, frantically adjusting valves in an attempt to restore the system's original configuration. The pressure readings are impossible. The hydraulic charges should be building toward activation, not dissipating into the drainage network. On the contrary, Holmes observed, watching the gauges with scientific interest, the readings are precisely what one would expect when a destructive hydraulic system is converted into a foundation stabilization network. Your 7 seals will indeed be opened tonight, but they will release strengthening compounds rather than destructive floods. At that moment, the first evidence of Holmes's counter-strategy became visible. From cracks in the ancient stonework, brilliant green streams began to seep, the fluorescent dye mixing with the redirected hydraulic pressure to create an unmistakable signature of the system's true function. Fluorescein, Holmes explained, as Lestrade's men moved to secure our adversaries. An aniline dye that becomes luminescent when mixed with water under pressure. What you intended as a weapon of destruction has become a visible demonstration of London's renewed structural integrity. The deductive resolution. As Inspector Lestrade placed Pemberton and Thornfield under arrest, Holmes provided the comprehensive explanation that would finally unravel the conspiracy we had pursued through London's underground labyrinth. Your first critical error, Professor Thornfield, was in believing that scholarly credentials would provide perfect camouflage for criminal conspiracy. When you presented Blackwood's journal, your marginalia betrayed itself through modern ink formulation, despite skillful aging techniques. More significantly, your interpretation of Victorian engineering metaphors was too literal. You understood the symbols as mystical pronouncements rather than the practical communications they actually represented. Holmes turned to Pemberton with something approaching professional respect. Your engineering expertise was formidable, Mr. Pemberton, but your obsession with historical grievances blinded you to the possibility that your technical superiority might be matched by superior deductive analysis. The brass medallion you so carefully planted contained not ancient mystical markings, but a personal cipher, the alpha, omega, and P forming a directional indicator that pointed directly to your family's historical involvement with the railway's 7th Division. The voice under Baker Street represented a masterpiece of acoustic engineering, Holmes continued, designed to create supernatural terror while concealing very human motivations. But Reverend Mortlake was merely your instrument, selected for his Welsh accent, his acoustic research, and his tragic family history. The expensive metallurgical components in his apparatus, the Portland cement in the supposedly ancient chambers, the eucalyptus oil used to mask copperwork, all pointed to resources and expertise far beyond a spiritualist's means. The foundation stones, remember. As we prepared to leave the chamber, Holmes paused to examine the carved symbols one final time, his expression carrying that mixture of intellectual satisfaction and genuine gravity that marked the conclusion of his most significant cases. The voice under Baker Street spoke truly when it declared that the foundation stones remember, he observed quietly. But what they remember is not ancient grievances or supernatural curses. They remember the enduring strength that has allowed this great city to survive every challenge that history has presented. The November fog was lifting as we emerged into the London night, and somewhere beneath our feet, the modified hydraulic system continued its work of strengthening the very foundations that had been targeted for destruction. The 7th seal had indeed been broken, but it had released renewal rather than ruin, ensuring that the metropolis would continue to stand secure upon the bedrock of its remarkable history. Epilogue. The voice silenced. In the days that followed, London's newspapers would celebrate the capture of the underground conspirators, with the same enthusiasm they had previously devoted to the railway ghost. The technical details of Pemberton's hydraulic network would be studied by engineering experts throughout the empire, though few would fully appreciate the elegant simplicity of Holmes's counter-strategy. Marcus Pemberton and Professor Thornfield would face justice for their conspiracy against the Crown, their elaborate scheme serving ultimately to strengthen rather than weaken the foundations they had sought to destroy. The voice under Baker Street had been permanently silenced, but its echoes would resonate through the corridors of power as a reminder that the true strength of any civilization lies not in its monuments, but in the dedication of those who choose to preserve rather than destroy the legacy of the past. The game was won, and London's foundation stones would indeed remember, not the grievances of the past, but the triumph of reason over revenge, of construction over destruction, and of the enduring human capacity to transform instruments of vengeance into tools of preservation. The grey November morning found Holmes in that state of intellectual satisfaction that marked the conclusion of his most complex cases. Our sitting room had been restored to its familiar comfort, though the maps and technical diagrams scattered across his workbench served as silent testimony to the conspiracy we had so recently unravelled. Inspector Lestrade sat with notebook poised, while I prepared to witness what I knew would be Holmes's masterful dissection of the entire affair. "Gentlemen," Holmes began, settling into his chair with characteristic precision. The voice under Baker Street represented perhaps the most sophisticated deception I have encountered, a conspiracy that combined historical grievance, technical brilliance, and theatrical misdirection to create what appeared to be supernatural manifestation, while concealing very human motivations for revenge. He lifted the brass medallion from our mantelpiece, examining it one final time through his magnifying glass. Our investigation began with this curious artifact, which I now recognize as the key that unlocked the entire mystery. The inscription MRC 7th, 1863 appeared to reference the Metropolitan Railway Company's 7th Division, but the true revelation lay in the microscopic cipher etched into its edge. The medallion's secret. Holmes produced his precision compass, demonstrating how the needle aligned with specific points of the seven-pointed star. This was not mystical symbolism, Watson, but a directional indicator pointing toward the true architect of our conspiracy. The intertwined letters Alpha, Omega, and a stylized P formed a personal signature: Marcus Alderton Pemberton, descendant of Thomas Pemberton, the original surveyor whose disappearance in 1863 had spawned 30 years of family grievance. Lestrade leaned forward with obvious interest. Then Mortlake was merely a pawn in Pemberton's game? Precisely. Reverend Mortlake possessed the Welsh accent, the acoustic expertise, and the tragic family history that made him the perfect instrument for Pemberton's theatrical deception. The evidence against him was too perfectly aligned, designed to be discovered and to lead Scotland Yard down a spiritualist path, while the true operations proceeded undetected. The technical mastery. Holmes moved to his chemical apparatus, where samples from the underground laboratory awaited final analysis. Pemberton's engineering credentials, honed in the mining operations of South Africa, provided him with sophisticated understanding of hydraulic systems and acoustic amplification. His voice under Baker Street utilized the culverted Tyburn River as a natural resonating chamber, projecting his words through copper tubes positioned at strategic points throughout the tunnel network. He indicated his detailed sketches of the hydraulic apparatus. The 7 seals referenced in the voice's pronouncements were not mystical artifacts, but 7 precisely calibrated valves designed to create cascading hydraulic failures at London's most vital points: the Bank of England, Parliament, St. Paul's Cathedral, the Royal Exchange. Each valve represented a calculated point of structural vulnerability that could bring the British Empire to its knees. Professor Thornfield's betrayal. Professor Thornfield's role proved equally calculated, Holmes continued, his expression carrying quiet disapproval. His scholarly credentials provided perfect camouflage for criminal conspiracy, while his expertise in Victorian archaeological discoveries lent credibility to the historical narrative Pemberton wished to exploit. His discovery of Blackwood's journal was carefully orchestrated revelation, though his marginalia betrayed itself through modern ink formulation, despite skillful aging techniques. I found myself still stinging from the professor's deception. His knowledge of the underground network seemed so genuine, Holmes. It was genuine, Watson, but acquired through months of reconnaissance rather than academic research. His casual navigation of Pemberton's subterranean laboratory and intimate familiarity with the hydraulic systems confirmed his active complicity. He was not merely an accomplice, he was the intellectual architect who provided historical framework for Pemberton's vengeful design. The counter-strategy. Explained, Holmes rose and moved to his collection of technical diagrams, tracing the modifications he had made to Pemberton's hydraulic network. The beauty of any engineering system, Watson, lies in its adherence to immutable physical laws. While Pemberton focused upon the destructive potential of concentrated hydraulic pressure, I redirected those same forces into constructive reinforcement of the structures he sought to undermine. He indicated specific valve positions on his sketches. By installing counter-pressure mechanisms at strategic points throughout the network, I ensured that Pemberton's 7 seals would release strengthening compounds rather than destructive floods. The fluorescein dye provided visible confirmation that London's foundations were being reinforced rather than weakened. The tragic resolution. Lestrade consulted his official reports with obvious satisfaction. Both conspirators are now in custody, though Thornfield's health appears to be failing under the strain of exposure. Holmes's expression grew more sombre. I fear, Inspector, that we must also address the matter of Reverend Mortlake's death. His convenient demise in Pentonville Prison deserves more thorough investigation than the official verdict of natural causes would suggest. The forensic truth. That afternoon brought us to the prison laboratory, where Holmes conducted a meticulous chemical analysis of tissue samples that the prison surgeon had preserved. His testing apparatus, though crude by laboratory standards, proved sufficient to reveal traces of antimony, tartar emetic, in concentrations that would account for the cardiac failure that had claimed Mortlake's life. Administered gradually over several days, Holmes explained, as he sealed the evidence in glass vials, this compound weakens the heart while masking itself as general malaise. Pemberton ensured that his instrument would not survive to provide testimony that might expose the full extent of the conspiracy. The subsequent coroner's inquest amended the official record, designating Mortlake's death as murder by person or persons unknown. It was a small victory for truth, though it could not restore the unfortunate clergyman to life. The moral reckoning. As we returned to Baker Street through the fog-shrouded evening, Holmes fell into one of his contemplative silences. When he finally spoke, his voice carried that mixture of intellectual satisfaction and genuine sorrow that marked his most profound cases. Watson, we have witnessed how historical grievance can be transformed into present danger through the application of superior intelligence and technical expertise. Marcus Pemberton possessed legitimate cause for anger. His grandfather was indeed murdered to prevent exposure of dangerous construction practices. Yet his response threatened to transform justified outrage into indiscriminate destruction. He paused at our familiar doorway, gazing back at the street where the voice had first called his name. The foundation stones of London do indeed remember, my dear fellow, but what they remember is not ancient curses or supernatural vengeance. They remember the enduring strength that allows civilization to survive every challenge that human ingenuity can devise, whether for construction or destruction. The final truth. That evening, as London's newspapers proclaimed the capture of the underground conspirators with characteristic enthusiasm, Holmes sat by our window with his violin across his knees, though the bow remained idle in his fingers. The case that had begun with mysterious voices and apparent supernatural manifestation had revealed itself to be entirely human in its motivations and methods. The voice under Baker Street spoke of covenants and seals, Watson, but the only covenant was one man's determination to make the present pay for the sins of the past. The only seals were hydraulic valves designed to flood the heart of the empire. In the end, it was not ancient magic that threatened London, but the very modern combination of historical obsession, technical expertise, and unlimited resources directed toward destructive ends. He lifted his violin then, drawing the bow across the strings to produce a single clear note that hung in the air like a thread of light. Yet we have also witnessed how those same forces, intelligence, expertise, and resources can be redirected toward preservation rather than destruction. The foundation stones will indeed remember this November, but they will remember it as the month when human reason triumphed over human revenge. The fog swirled past our windows like ghostly fingers, and somewhere beneath our feet, the modified hydraulic system continued its work of strengthening the very structures that had been targeted for destruction. The voice under Baker Street had been permanently silenced, but its echoes would resonate through the corridors of power as a reminder that the true strength of any civilization lies not in its monuments, but in the dedication of those who choose to preserve rather than destroy the legacy of the past. The game, as Holmes was fond of saying, had been played to its logical and utterly satisfying conclusion. London's foundation stones would remember, but what they would remember was the triumph of deduction over deception, of construction over destruction, and of the enduring human capacity to transform instruments of vengeance into tools of preservation.